So today I'm talking to Mr. Robert Pei, a lawyer based in Melbourne, Australia. Robert was born and raised in Sarawak before he left for New Zealand to further his studies. He's the president of a thing called Sabah Sarawak Rights Australia New Zealand. So Robert, thank you very much for coming to my podcast. Can you tell us what does your organization stands for and what is it campaigning for?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, James, for inviting me to your talk. The acronym SSRANZ is Sabah Sarawak Rights in Australia and New Zealand. As it says, our organization was created in 2017 and is a registered organization in Australia. And we basically have been formed to highlight and defend the rights of Sabahans and Sarawakians within the current state of Malaysia, and to highlight the issues which have arisen over the last 56 years, which have been become a burden and a detriment to the people in Sabah and Sarawak.
Yeah, but what are you campaigning for? What exactly
yes,
are you campaigning for?
Well, our campaign is focusing on one of the main issues, which is questioning the legitimacy of the formation of Malaysia and the Malaysia Agreement 1963. And since we started, we have held a number of meetings and forums to discuss the question of the Malaysia Agreement and the issue of its validity.
So basically you are arguing, I don't want to put words in our mouth, but I sort of summarize it. So you're arguing that the whole Malaysia Act and the whole process of the formation of the Federation are invalid. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, well, this is based on our research and based on the decolonized, declassified colonial documents. We have concluded that the creation of Malaysia was not completed and not consistent with the rights of the Sabah and Sarawak people, with their right to self-determination, and that as it stands, the Malaysia Agreement is not valid, and therefore Malaysia is no more than a de facto union. In other words, it's not really legitimate.
Sure. If that is the case, then obviously if you said that the Malaysia Agreement is not valid, then I'm assuming that you're talking about under international law and the UN thing on self-determination. If that is the case, how are you going to bring this process forward?
Well, I think we probably have to explain firstly why MA63 is not valid, because I believe there's a lot of people back home in Sabah or Sarawak are still not clear about the legal issues affecting the validity of the so-called treaty. The treaty was supposed to include 5 countries signing an agreement to form a federation called Malaysia. And it is my conclusion that the whole process was flawed. And legally, international law requires that all countries or nations which are parties to a treaty must have the capacity to make treaties. So by definition, only independent sovereign states have capacity or competence to make treaties with other states. However, clearly in 1963, when MA63 was signed, Singapore, North Borneo or Sabah, and Sarawak were still colonies. And this was confirmed by the colonial secretary at the time, Duncan Sands, who, in rejecting Singapore's declaration for unilateral independence, he said that Singapore UDI was illegal because for any territory, British territory, to achieve independence, it must be done through an act of parliament in Westminster in the UK. So actually the UK has to pass an act or a law to grant independence to its colonies. And at the time, none of the three territories were independent.
Sure.
And
Well, having said that, let's move along. Obviously, you're going into details of history. I think it'll be difficult for the viewers to follow. But basically, your argument is that the territories in Southeast Asia were not competent because they are not sovereign states, and therefore they could not negotiate independence or negotiate any other political union. That's basically your argument. Now, moving
yes,
forward to today in 2020, what sort of remedies are available? How are you going to, legally speaking, how are you going to litigate to show that the Malaysia Act was invalid, the whole Federation of Malaysia was invalid?
yes, this is a very difficult question that has to be looked at and resolved. And the way forward might be seen in the recent Chagos Islands case, which was uh, decided by the International Court of Justice, the highest court of the United Nations, on the question of an agreement made between the UK and Mauritius in 1965. The agreement was to separate a part of the territory of Mauritius, being the Chagos Islands, from the Mauritian territory. And at the time the agreement was made, Mauritius was still a colony fully under the United Kingdom's control. And the case went up to the United Nations, which passed a resolution which directed that the matter be referred to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion.
Sorry,
and,
Robert, you have to speak louder. Your voice is getting softer and softer.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, to make it short, the International Court of Justice decided that at the time the agreement was made.
Can I just do a factual correction? It was not a judgment, it was an advisory opinion.
Yes, I have said so.
Yeah.
At the time the agreement was made, Mauritius was still fully under the control of the UK. It had no legislative or executive powers to enter into an agreement with the UK. And this was a decision of the court, and it said, therefore, it was not a binding international agreement. Right. And from there, the court recommended that the United Kingdom immediately decolonize the Chagos and return them to Mauritius. Now, your question was what sort of legal recourse we have in terms of seeking independence for Sabah and Sarawak, and how to bring the issue to court or any court. Obviously, the issue is being promoted by a movement or a broad independence movement or nationalist movement in Sabah and Sarawak. I mean, each of the states have their own movement. And the question is, how can this movement gain any traction with their campaign? I mean, neither Sabah or Sarawak state government are keen to support the campaign for independence. And despite, the Sarawak government opinion is actually divided. The Chief Minister Abang Johari has said Sarawak will always be part of Malaysia, whereas some of his party members have said that the Malaysia agreement was just a political arrangement, and that it was for the people to decide whether they want to remain in Malaysia or go for independence, as Singapore did. So there is a divided opinion within the Sarawak government, and from the point of view of activists who are campaigning for independence, the question is, how do we make it the majority opinion in the state government, and how to get the state government to go further and challenge MA63, and failing that, what is the alternative? The alternative was recently raised by another lawyer from Sarawak. Um, this is the question of how do we get an NGO movement to get a voice in the UN. The UN has an avenue for NGOs to approach them to seek their help in relation to issues affecting them. And this may be one way to go to draw the attention of the UN to the situation in Sabah and Sarawak, on the basis that the creation of Malaysia being based on a primary objective, according to Tunku Abdul Rahman, to develop Sabah and Sarawak, have actually ended up a total failure, because it became the recolonization of Sabah and Sarawak instead of development of the two territories. We can see that the federal government has since 1976 seized control of Sabah and Sarawak's oil and gas resources. And this is one of the biggest issues that is affecting the relationship between the federal government and the states. And at this stage, the issues have been renegotiated between the two sides. And the question is, why is it after 56 years, such matters have to be renegotiated when it's all supposed to be settled when the MA63 was signed? And it therefore means that the federal government has actually admitted that it had never implemented those rights and guarantees in which the people of Sabah and Sarawak had given up independence and accepted to say, well, I wouldn't say accept, because the people would never have the chance to make a free choice in a referendum to accept or not accept Malaysia or go for independence. But it was more the nominees of people who signed the agreement, the Malaysia agreement, that had caused the transfer of sovereignty over Sabah and Sarawak to Malaya, and thus, letting the two territories become territories of Malaya and rename Malaysia. So now the question of how do we get this on track in the World Forum? I don't think there is any argument that Malaysia has failed and failed miserably. And I have written to the Prime Minister Mahathir when he was Prime Minister last year, and I have written to urge him to discuss the question of Sabah, question of Sarawak independence on the basis that we have been through 56 years and that the promises of Malaysia have not been fulfilled, and the questions about the validity of MA63 were also raised.
Okay, can I just come in here quickly? I have to make it very clear. This is your opinion and the opinion of your organization, because you can also go to Sarawak and Sabah. there will be politicians and what do you call it, the professional class over there who will disagree with the assertion that Malaysia has failed. So I just want to make it very clear that this is what you're campaigning for, and this is what you think is happening. It is not what do you call it. It is not the full view of all the people of Sabah and Sarawak, because I'm sure there will be people who will disagree with you.
Yes, we know who will disagree because they are the people who really benefited from the formation of Malaysia. And an honest survey of the situation both in Sabah and Sarawak, we can see that people are living in great poverty, and it is a accepted statement that both Sabah and Sarawak are the most poverty-stricken states in the Federation. And this was a conclusion of the World Bank, I think was in 2015 or around the time. And statistically, both Sabah and Sarawak are among the world's most underdeveloped in terms of infrastructures and so on. And it is borne by the fact that to this day, both of the state governments are still talking about development, and even very basic developments haven't been finished, such as the trunk road or the so-called Pan-Borneo Highway hasn't been finished since it was started in 1966. So it is really a symbol of the failure of Malaysia, that this has happened.
But the counter argument to that is that the failure to develop Sabah and Sarawak can also be blamed on the state political leaders themselves. If you talk about facts, you can also argue there's been plenty of reports that speak about high-level corruption in Sabah and Sarawak,
yes,
especially in terms of resource timber industry. So you cannot, you cannot just say that this is the fault of the federal government, because the other side of the coin is that the politicians from Sarawak, for the most part of the 50 years, they've always been part of the federal government.
very true, and I fully agree with that. And the fact that the Sabah and Sarawak governments have been able to endorse the private funder of their respective states is because they have the backing and support of the federal government. If you notice from those anti-logging struggles in the past years, there were always the government troops and police who were there to stop the timber blockades and so on, and it's still going on. And and then you got to look at how the federal side also benefits from all these.
Sure. Putting that to one side, I mean, we can talk for a long time about this issue. It's not going to leak anywhere. So coming back to your issue of creating awareness, I can understand that, but I'm more interested in this issue of trying to gain support to some sort of a legal proceedings against the UK. I'm just wondering how are you going to go about it, given the fact that the UN essentially is a club of sovereign states. I'm working on the assumption, and I don't think, well, in fact, I don't think it's an assumption, it's a fact that Putrajaya obviously is not going to support anything that will make themselves look back. In other words, they're not going to support anybody who goes around telling other countries that Malaysia agreement or the whole process of creating the formation of Malaysia was a flawed process. So I'm just wondering, how are you going to bring this to the international stage? I think what is quite obvious about the Chagos case is that most people do not realize that the Chagos case did not start as an issue of territory. It started off about marine protection area. It started from there, then it got bigger and bigger, and it became an issue about territory. The other thing about the Chagos case is that the Chagos case was actually supported by members of the African Union, which is like ASEAN collection of countries in Africa. So I'm just wondering, given the different circumstances, how are you going to get people to support this notion of how should I say, reviewing the whole process of the formation of Malaysia?
Of course, there is a process going on between the federal and state government, which is in reality a sort of review, which was overdue since 1973. Under the Malaysia Agreement, there was an understanding that the Malaysia agreement was to be reviewed after 10 years in 1973. And at the time, certain issue came up which allowed the federal government to arbitrarily postpone and delay the review, and then it never happened. So I think around 2012 onwards, there was a change in the awareness, and also they were undergoing contradictions between the federal and state governments, which I think it led on to a questioning of the loss of rights and guarantees
No,
given
I
in the
understand.
Malaysian
I understand
agreement.
that, Robert. I understand,
Yes,
but you're not answering my question. My question was that how are you going to build international support for
yes.
this cause?
In answer to that, yes, I'm saying there is currently some sort of negotiation, and it is a token negotiation. But what we want is a full-on review of the Malaysia agreement, and how has it benefited or not benefited the people who are in it. Um, the I mentioned earlier that as NGOs, we must look at how to engage the UN on a conversation about all those issues. And I'm in the process of writing a letter to the Secretary of the United Nations to raise with him this very issue about how the UN had actually endorsed a fraudulent scheme in which Sabah and Sarawak were annexed into the Federation of Malaysia. Um, this is actually going over the MA63 itself, because it actually saying the UN had wrongfully engaged in the recolonization of two territories. And I'm sure in the current environment, the UN might be more acceptable to our approach. But this is something we need to explore with the movements in Sarawak, especially the activists, whether they want to look at this. I mean, there is already actually an NGO in the UN which represents the Dayak tribes in Borneo. You might be aware of that. And they are there purely to highlight the rights of the Dayaks and native tribes.
Sure, but I'm just wondering whether this strategy of using the NGO as a platform, because I'm more interested in the legal side, because I'm just wondering, because if we look at high profile cases, people who are seeking independence, who are trying to create a homeland, obviously I'm sure you come across the case of the Kurds. They've been fighting for their own homeland for at least half a century. They have some support in the international arena. They have an autonomous government in northern Iraq. But despite all this, they find that they are still locked out of the UN system. They've tried very hard to get the issue of the Kurds on the UN agenda for the last 50 years. They've not been able to do it. Another group, which is also interesting, also seeking self-determination, of course, the Palestinians. I'm sure you're well aware of that. This one is even more interesting because they have the official support of the OIC, the Islamic countries. Again, fighting for many, many years since the 1960s. Again, they've gotten nowhere. So I'm just wondering, if you talk about the legal route, which I assume is under international law, how are you going to proceed for this? Because building popular support and building public awareness is one thing, but that usually doesn't lead to any a real political solution at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, is either you can make the Malaysian federal government relook at this whole issue, or you said this whole thing was declared invalid and therefore you look for a third option. So
Yes.
I'm just wondering, you talk about all these things. It seems to me that you talk on the one hand awareness, on the other hand you talk about trying to use the international law. I'm just wondering, exactly what is your strategy? I mean,
Right.
I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm just wondering because I think a lot of people watching this are wholly supportive of this idea that we need to relook at the Malaysia agreement. But I think
Yes.
the middle class also wants to know that is this a viable thing? That's the bottom
Well,
line.
I think I'm still really talking about raising awareness because, in my opinion, um, although there is certainly a great aspiration for independence in Sarawak, there is still a need to actually get the ideas through. And what I'm saying is that, from my point of view, legally, we have a case. We have a very good case, in fact. We have solid evidence from the declassified colonial evidence that the British actually deliberately went ahead and created a false document called MA63 to legitimize its transfer of Sarawak sovereignty to Malaya. I mean, what I'm saying is that even though we have solid evidence, the problem is how we get it, on board, say, into a court to challenge it. And that comes to the question of, can we litigate the matter in, say, Malaysia, in a Malaysian court? There's nothing to stop us to file a claim, right? There's nothing to stop us to raise that matter. The question at the moment is the issue of standing, and the state government is the party that has the standing, which is required to bring the matter, to a head. But actually, what is happening, as I said just now, is that they entered into so-called negotiations rather than take the matter to court. And they are not taking the matter to court since it doesn't really require them to challenge the validity of MA63. If we want to launch a challenge in court, we still need to file a writ to have the matter heard. So the issue of standing will come up, right? And on what basis can we challenge MA63? So it falls back to the question of whether we can mount a class action based on MA63. And from there, it is the question of the failure of MA63 promises to develop and advance the people of Sarawak, which is, well, I mean, you can, I think there's no disagreement about that issue. If we look at the conditions of the ordinary people and the conditions they live in, Sarawak is still far behind the peninsular states in terms of development. In fact, the wealth of Sabah and Sarawak have been transferred to develop the states of Malaya. So whether the court will accept this argument, we have to try it out if we are really going further with any legal action.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, activists who are aligned with your cause are thinking of filing a suit in the Malaysian court rather than under international law. Is that what I'm saying? Is that what I'm hearing, or am I hearing it wrong?
Well, you are asking me the alternative. So this is one alternative, but the fact is that in filing such a suit, we base it on the issue that Malaysia agreement was not valid, and consequently, the federal control of Sabah and Sarawak is illegitimate. And this is an issue which the court must decide. But whether the court will say we don't have the jurisdiction or we don't believe you have standing, there are two issues there which have to be resolved. And also, the other alternative we are thinking of is whether we can join the Sarawak government in the action as a party to trash up these issues. So that is a possibility, but whether the Sarawak government will agree is a different thing.
Right. So finally, one final question. Time is running out. On the issue of local standard, can I just ask a very blatant question? Why should the people of Sabah and Sarawak take you seriously when you're no longer a Malaysian citizen?
Well, I'm born and bred Sarawakian, and I must say, I might be out of the country, but my heart, the country is still in my heart, and I'm still a Sarawakian. And the fact is that as a student, I was awakened to the issue of Sarawak independence in 1963 when the people of Sarawak were very much aware that something was happening and that suddenly British rule was going to be transformed to Malayan rule. And this was an issue which I affected me quite strongly. And in fact, I spent decades uh, involved in this issue. And it's only in the past, say, 10 years when the internet became much more effective, it enabled me to link up and to expand on my views on the creation of Malaysia. I I believe that whether I am qualified or not to be talking about this issue probably is not the issue itself, but the fact that it has to be raised, and anyone can raise this issue. It doesn't have to be a Sarawakian. And the fact that I'm a Sarawakian, it actually makes me more inspired to go into the subject and try to help the people in Sarawak to resolve the issue.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Robert. I'm sorry we don't have enough time, but with today's generation, if the podcast is too long, they won't even bother to watch it. So it's better to have something short. And I
Yes.
think we've covered quite a lot of grounds today. So thank you very much, Robert. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate your invitation and chance to talk about the Malaysia